Have you ever heard of the madman who on a bright morning lighted a lantern and ran to the marketplace calling out unceasingly, "I seek God! I seek God!" As there were many people standing about who did not believe in God, he caused a great deal of amusement. "Why, is he lost?" said one. "Has he strayed away like a child?" said another. "Does he keep himself hidden? Is he afraid of us? Has he taken a sea voyage? Has he emigrated?" The people cried out laughingly, all in a hubbub. The insane man jumped into their midst and transfixed them with his glances. "Where is God gone?" he called out. "I mean to tell you, we have killed him, you and I. We are all his murderers. But how have we done it? How were we able to drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the whole horizon? What did we do when we loosened this earth from its sun? Whither does it now move? Whither do we move? Away from all suns? Do we not dash on unceasingly, backwards, sideways, forwards, in all directions? Is there still an above and below? Do we not stray as through infinite nothingness? Does not empty space breathe upon us? Has it not become colder? Does not night come on continually, darker and darker? Shall we not have to light lanterns in the morning? Do we not hear the noise of the grave diggers who are burying God? Do we not smell the divine putrefaction? For even gods putrefy. God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we console ourselves, the most murderous of all murderers? The holiest and the mightiest that the world has hitherto possessed has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe the blood from us? With what water could we cleanse ourselves? What lustrations, what sacred games shall we have to devise? Is not the magnitude of this deed too great for us? Shall we not ourselves have to become gods merely to seem worthy of it? There never was a greater event, and on account of it, all who are born after us belong to a higher history than any history hitherto. Here the madman was silent and looked again at his hearers. They were all silent and looked at him in surprise. At last he threw his lantern on the ground so that it broke in pieces and was extinguished. "I come too early," he then said. "I'm not yet at the right time. This prodigious event is still on its way and is travelling. It has not yet reached men's ears. Lightning and thunder need time. The light of stars needs time. Deeds need time, even after they are done, to be seen and heard. This deed is as yet further from them than the furthest star, and yet they have done it." It is further stated that the madman made his way into different churches on the same day, and there intoned his requiem aeternam Deo. When led out and called to account, he always gave the reply, "What are these churches now, if they are not the tombs and monuments of God?" So, the idea that God is dead and we have killed him. This seems to imply that it's not as though we realize that God does not exist. It's that God somehow existed because we believed in him, and now that we have decided or come to the conclusion that he no longer exists, therefore he no longer exists. So it's kind of a worldview based on the idea that what you believe determines the nature of reality. So this is kind of coming from a phenomenological or psychological perspective, which goes against the traditional kind of empirical worldview. So in terms of like the Enlightenment narrative, in terms of what reality is as defined by empiricism, it's the world is the external world. And our senses have access to the world as it exists in itself. So it's as though the world is real despite the manner in which we interpret it or we apprehend it. It exists whether we are there to be conscious of it or not. The problem with this is, although we may be able to form this conclusion that there is a world outside of us, which would be the idea of the Kantian thing in itself, which he addresses in Critique of Pure Reason, we don't have access to it, even if we can say that it exists. All we can say is that there might be an existence exterior to our apprehension of existence, exterior to the conscious subject, but beyond that we can't really say anything. So this basically if you take this idea seriously, the entire enlightenment or the entire empirical view of reality collapses. Because then you have to state that, well, essentially everything is interpretation in some sense. This is actually, Nietzsche is famous for saying there is no truth, there is only interpretation. So then we have to reframe the question. The question is no longer what is reality in itself. The question is what is reality to us? And therefore, what does that mean? What does the participation of the conscious subject in the construction of reality imply about the nature of reality? This is connoted with, well, Nietzsche comes from a biological evolutionary view of truth. This isn't completely saturated within his work or anything, but he does bring it up a few times, and I think implicitly it does underline his entire ideas about the will's power and whatnot. If we're going to imply the evolutionary framework to empiricism, and I think this is the only way you can make sense of empiricism. Empiricism does work within the evolutionary paradigm, but without the evolutionary paradigm, empiricism falls apart. So within the evolutionary paradigm, adaptation is constantly occurring. So we kind of have a conception of adaptation or evolution as something that purely takes place over long periods of time. But if you think about it, if you take the evolutionary framework to its logical conclusion, then you are never outside of a state of adaptation to reality. So let's take the empirical perspective from that, the empirical conception of reality from that perspective. So even the act of perception is an adaptation. So even if we're going to assert that maybe it is possible to perceive reality outside of applying an interpretive framework, which it isn't possible to do, but we'll get to that. Even if we were going to suppose that that is possible, you're still converting whatever this external sensory data is into these a priori faculties, or these we don't see atoms, we don't see what reality is in itself, as we already said. We see how a reality appears to us in order for us to be able to function. So our sensory apparatuses, which have evolved to keep us alive, are in taking this sensory data and translating it into particular conceptions which are oriented towards the practical relevance of what is perceived. So these conceptions of reality are partly biological. So if you see food, an instinct will come and will take over you, if you're hungry, and then you'll want to eat it. You don't see a bunch of atoms sitting over there amongst all other atoms that are basically the same as everything else. Then there's also cultural conceptions of reality, which step in where the biological are insufficient. So that the cultural becomes more and more relevant in terms of how you should act in a broader sense. Biology tells you how you should act in terms of specific things like food, hunger, like reproduction, detection of threat, all things like that, things that are suited to immediacy. But when you get to a broader and broader levels of abstraction in terms of like how do you function in a way that satisfies the biological needs and desires, as well as allows you to participate in society, that's where culture steps in. And so those are also, in a sense, a priori interpretive frameworks. They are inherited the same way biological modes of interaction through reality are inherited, but they're just a shorter time span. They're being encoded into culture rather than biology, so then you learn them through inundation. I would still social inundation. I would still call them a priori because our cultural framework has been inherited through our ancestors. So they're tools which have not been developed by you through experience. They allow you. They are predicates for experience. They're predicates for being able to interact with reality in a functional manner. So an example of that would just be like treat others the way you'd want to treat yourself. That's the Christian one. In a modern society, or in a modern Western society at the very least, you wouldn't be able to function cohesively if that was not an a priori framework that you adopted. don't steal, all these, don't kill, all these basic things like that. Anyway, so it's not as though these a priori frameworks are just exist in some immutable transcendent sphere. However, they are in a process of adaptation, because you have to, all these broad ideas about how you should act, they are only, they don't have any practical relevance unless implied in the immediate. So you need to apply them in a particular situation. Then you'll find out that these broad abstractions don't actually apply in such a perfect and cohesive manner as the abstractions themselves. So you have to modify them and figure out the best way in which to achieve those ends within your current situation, while simultaneously modifying these broad abstract a priori frameworks by which you interact with reality in accordance with what you learn from your environment. So these a priori cultural frameworks are in constant state of adaptation in accordance with fluctuations or environmental transformations. The same can be said about these biological a priori modes of being, behavioral patterns or instincts is what we'll call them. But they take much, much longer periods of time to adapt. So we need to adapt them in accordance with culture. But that's in a sense is a form of updating or evolving the instincts, but just like the instincts in their most broad and general sense, such as hunger or sexuality or whatever, we may as well deem these things as eternal, as ancient people did, because they just, the nature of such drives would just take so long to evolve, in their nature, or maybe their nature fundamentally doesn't even change. And so far as we know, we can't say insofar as there has been life, there has been some kind of reproductive or instinct, as well as hunger and stuff like that. So anyway, now that we have that out of the way, we can continue. So let's think about this, like these cultural frameworks in terms of interacting with reality, which are like the top evolutionary interaction with reality, which is the domain in which consciousness is suited for. So commensurability with reality would be truth. So your conception about how you should act aligns with the external world. That's how you know that your framework, your a priori framework is reflects reality or is true, or in an evolutionary sense is evolutionarily optimal. It's sufficient to get you by in the world in order for the species to continue itself. Then the bottom, which is the more fundamental, is the behavioral. So that's where it's like incompatibility with reality or incommensurability is pain and commensurability is pleasure. So underlying an abstract idea of what reality is, which would be a match. Reality is fundamentally a match between your a priori framework and the external world. Because we don't have, as we said before, we don't have access to the external world in itself. We only know that we are living in accordance with the external world, or we only have any kind of insight into the nature of the external world through our apprehension or interaction with it, and the fundamental manner in which we are able to determine that we are right, or that our a priori conceptions are accurate or valid, is through their functional utility. So if we go to the bottom level, which is pain and pleasure, the sensory or behavioral manner in which we interact with reality, reality could be defined as a mode of being, a pattern of behavior. You know you're acting in accordance with reality if the way you're acting is mostly in accordance with satisfying pleasure and avoiding pain. So in the most fundamental sense, reality is a match between the instincts and evolutionary necessity. So reality is more of a feeling. You're intuiting, things feel real. Reality feels real or it feels unreal. And then we make abstractions as to why that is. But the root of what determines the nature of reality is actually an intuition or a sensation, not an abstraction. In order to come to an understanding of God from an evolutionary point of view, we're going to have to go a bit into the nature of adaptation or how evolution works. Not on a gene level, on a behavioral level, on an instinct level, how the instincts get updated. So before we continue, I don't want to go into this too much, but you just need to get the idea of random mutation out of your head, because it's completely groundless. Randomness is how we explain that which we have no explanation for. It doesn't actually exist in the real world. If there was no adaptation, is environment specific. Adaptation is an experiment in accordance with the environment. It's the organism's attempt to generate the best adaptive, or the only adaptive strategy it possibly can in order to get by. And if it functions, then it will persist. And if that adaptation is successful, then it'll persist. And if it isn't, then it won't. It's not random. It's not randomness which ensures that an organism survives. It's an alignment with the experiment or mutation and the transformation of the external world. But if there was no capacity of the organism to adapt to the transformation of the external world, to mutate in accordance with evolutionary necessity, then there could be no life. There would be no continuity in evolution. Reality would be in a constant state of entropy, essentially. So we have to come from the conclusion, base this off the assumption that there is some kind of adaptive function, some capacity to recognize changes in the environment and modify the instincts in accordance with it. But anyway, before we get into that, so we've pointed out that pain and pleasure are the fundamental manner in which an organism interacts with reality. So I'm going to explain this idea of adaptation with the idea of consciousness, of human consciousness, just abstracted, because we'll have to get into this later. What we're doing here is kind of trying to explain how adaptations exist pre-consciousness or without the participation of consciousness. So pain and pleasure are basically automated functions. So if an object appears threatening, pain will arise, or if something threatening happens to the organism or whatever. And if desire is either satisfied, or an intimation that desire can be satisfied, or an intimation of an object within the vicinity of the organism that could satisfy desire, like nutrition or reproduction or whatever, that will trigger pleasure. So pleasure occurs, therefore, in an environment in which there is a match between the organism and the external world. As we said, a preponderance of pleasure in our life is the means by which you determine that, the means by which things feel real, that you're living in accordance with reality. So when there's a match between pleasure, because pleasure occurs when in the vicinity of desire, or when in consuming desire, that tells you that the preponderance of pleasure throughout time and a lacking of pain will insinuate to you that there is no need to adapt, basically. Pain is for anomaly. So by anomaly, we don't just mean necessarily objects that have never been encountered before, but we mean objects that the organism has not evolved the evolution of the organism has been insufficient to allow it to contend with that object, to overcome it, to either make it an object of pleasure by consuming it, or it's things in the evolutionary landscape. Pre-consciousness are objects of desire, essentially, or objects of threat at the most fundamental level, and there's nothing else. There's no other reality outside of that. Any other reality that isn't relevant to those two biological subsystems never enter consciousness, because there's no need for them to. So that they're the fundamental constituents of reality for all intents and purposes. So pleasure is the motivational stimulus for desire, whereas pain is basically instinct for self-preservation. So it's that which inhibits desire in accordance with escaping the situation, basically, and trying to find safety. So we could say that desire or pleasure is the instinct by which the organism is able to propagate itself and the species throughout time. Pain is the instinct which serves to preserve the individual and the immediate. And these two So pleasure, since all life essentially, this may be an exception for humanity, but as we said, we're explaining pre-conscious life. For all life, pleasure is the normative function. So in everyday life, the desire and the external world are aligned, and therefore there's more of a preponderance of pleasure, which basically means the structure of the organism is sufficient to allow it to propagate itself throughout time. So the reason why, therefore, anything that has any potential for threat is not, and either it's not in the environment, it's just not there at all, or it doesn't enter consciousness. Because the potential of threat, if entered consciousness, would inhibit pain, would inhibit pleasure, would inhibit the pursuit of desire. Because as we said, pain is ultimately an inhibitory instinct. So even if there is potentially threatening objects, if it's not of sufficient level of threat to warrant the inhibition of the pursuit of desire, then it will not enter consciousness. As we said, the normative state for organisms is that pleasure is the superordinate function. It's the normative state. When there's nothing happening, when you just wake up in the morning, desire comes to being, and that gives you the pleasure or the motivational stimulus to go and pursue it. But if you come in contact with threat perpetually in the pursuit of desire, then obviously, like, there's a conflict between pain and pleasure. And the only way to resolve that, if there is only automated instincts in accordance with the environment, and it's just random mutation, like, there is no way to overcome that. When there's anomaly, when there's too much threat, when there's something happens, when there's a shift in the environment, in the evolutionary landscape, there's nothing you can do to rectify and you're dead instantly. There's no adaptation can take place. Therefore, we have to assume that there is some kind of adaptive function which serves to reconcile or update the instincts. So I'm terming this the adaptive function. So the adaptive function cannot operate during consciousness for the most part. We'll get into instances where it can later, but for all intents and purposes, it is only functions during unconsciousness, during sleep, because it only works through a conflicting of instincts. So when during waking life, you're in a constant state of action. You're constantly possessed by an instinct, by the necessity to pursue desire, pleasure, or the necessity to escape threat, pain. And you're always possessed by one of those two instincts to a certain extent. During unconsciousness, during sleep, however, a simulation will take place. So this adaptive function will create or recreate a simulation of particular scenarios or objects which created this conflict during waking life, if this occurred, between pleasure and pain, if anomalies occurred. And it will try to process this anomaly. So what it does is it recreates something equivalent to this scenario that occurs in waking life. It has to occur constantly. It can only work through pattern detection, essentially. We will get into that. But it recreates it, and then the instincts kind of, we're defining the you, or the organism, as an instinct, essentially. This is pre-consciousness, as we said. There's no uniform personality. There's just disparate instincts. So you are, for all intents and purposes, the instincts, and the instincts play out in this simulated evolutionary landscape created by the adaptive function, which is a dream. So through that playing out, you will reconfigure the sensory connotations of these objects. So if we use an example, so if a predator constantly goes down a particular route to find prey, and there's this particular tree that always passes, this is used as like an insinuation for there is prey over here. It triggers its memory and therefore triggers its instinctual response for the pursuit of pleasure. However, as of recently, constantly, there has been, through that direction, through pursuing that route towards prey, there has been predators. So this has happened perpetually, and it's only just escaped death, essentially, multiple times in pursuit of prey. Now, in this dream, perhaps this landscape will be recreated. It'll go past that tree, but in the dream, a predator will be right behind it. So then, and it will die maybe, and then that will wake it up. Then in waking life, so this causes a reconfiguration of sensory data. So now in a waking life, when one comes behind that tree, this will cause a fear response, an inhibitory response. And so the organism will avoid taking that route. So the same thing happens with pleasure now. So if a behavioral pattern is inhibited or is demonstrated in the simulation to be redundant, as we just gave an example for, it will need to find a substitute source of desire. It'll do the same thing. It'll, in any situation that the adaptive function can pick up, which could possibly serve as a substitute source of desire, it will now present in the dream as, you know, the prey will be in this other location, which there were insinuations that there might have been prey in waking life in, although that may have not entered consciousness because the instincts will have been oriented towards this other prior tree or spot that it's used to going to, which is now full of predators. So the risk in that, or the reason why the organism would not pursue this alternate or substitute route without the adaptive function operating, is because, as we said, there's no consciousness, it's just instinct. So you're just acting in accordance with preordained patterns of behavior. In order to create a new pattern of behavior, there needs to be a disrupting of the old one. Also, the evolutionary utility of the fact of always pursuing the same route is that the other route possesses uncertainty. So there actually might be prey. There might be predators in this other route. We don't know, in this other substitute route that the adaptive function formulates. We don't know. That's the thing with anomaly, but it will prefer that route, that potential for threat, because it doesn't know one way or the other whether it's threat or whether, but there is a hint that there is prey there. So it will prefer that, or it'll substitute that for a particular route that has become, that the instincts already identify with, which it is certain that there will be prey within. All very technical, sorry about that, but I think this is necessary to understand what we're saying. So now, when we're in a situation where we have explained how the adaptive function overcomes anomaly or change environmental transformations, shifts in the evolutionary landscape. If that is successful, the process we just described, then adaptation occurs, adaptation of the instincts, and then the organism will continue to function. If this fails, however, if this can fail, the adaptive function can be insufficient. If the anomalies are just constant and diverse, so that it can't actually generate a new pattern of behavior. So the reason why this would be the case is the adaptive function. So think about it like this. We already said the instincts are essentially automated, so they function through the constant reoccurrence of sufficiently similar phenomena to which they are adapted in order to function. So as we said, if there's a tree that is constantly passed that gives an insinuation that there is prey, the instincts act in accordance with it. It needs to be constant repetition of something relatively similar to what it's adapted to. Similarly, with the adaptive function, anomalies have to occur with enough, or by anomalies we mean like breaks in instincts, or an insufficiently severe instinct, shift in the environment. They need to occur. Those shifts in the environment need to occur with sufficient regularity, or they need to be of a sufficiently qualitatively similar nature for the adaptive function to be able to pick up on what the error is exactly and how to avoid it. But if there's just constant change everywhere, then there's no predictability in the change. There's no manner in which to ascertain this is the error and this is its potential substitute, then it won't succeed, and the species will become extinct essentially. But this is what has happened to humanity, except we have not become extinct. So the normative state for pre-conscious life, at the very least, if not life in general, the normative state is desire or pleasure, a seeking of the objects, the motivation that causes the organism to seek the objects of desire. Now, the reason that this is because for most life, the instincts and objects, which they exist in relation to are aligned. There isn't a break between them. This is because breaks between the behavioral patterns and the objects which they exist in relation to that is the reason why species become extinct fundamentally. An insufficiency of the patterns of behavior it has evolved throughout its evolutionary development for the evolutionary requirements of the present. So basically what this implies is that anomalies have been sufficiently uncommon, or not have been sufficiently minor and regular for the adaptive function to be able to modify the instincts in accordance with. Now, the reason why the adaptive function has not been sufficient to accomplish this for humanity is, as we said, there's just an overwhelming array of anomaly and no predictability involved. So basically what this implies is that the normative state is not necessarily desire or pleasure, the motivation which stimulates desire. The normative state then becomes, in this situation, suffering or pain. The objects at which... So, an organism wakes up from its process of adaptation, which occurs during unconsciousness, and the objects in its vicinity insinuate to it routes by which to pursue desire. All there is potential objects of desire in its vicinity. Now, these objects of desire cause the opposite result, the inhibitory, emotional response which inhibits the instincts for humanity or for an unadapted specimen, because the adaptive function has not been able to rectify this anomaly. So the conflict of instincts continues during waking life. So as a result of this is as a result of the predominance or the superordinate position of suffering, of the inhibitory response. This will cause the inhibition of desire causes sleepiness or tiredness, a lack of motivational stimulus. So this is basically because the organism will then have to rest or have to sleep. It'll have to continue the process of adaptation, and just allow the adaptive function through continual sleep to be able to generate new patterns of behavior, because the risk of pursuing desire in a state where the instincts are not adapted to the external world is too great. This is the reason why depressed people or even physically ill people sleep all the time, sleeping way more, because depression is basically a misalignment between patterns of behavior and the requirements of the external world, between evolutionary necessity and the composition of the organism. So it will have to continue its adaptation in the hope that it will be able to generate or avoid anomaly in regards to its adaptation of instincts, and thus regenerate desire as a result. The problem with this is, however, that through not pursuing desire, you're not attaining or generating the empirical material which the adaptive function can use to generate new patterns of behavior. As we said, the adaptive function necessitates the constant reoccurrence of anomaly in order to adapt the instincts in accordance with. Otherwise, it might cause a maladaptation, because maybe this one particular anomaly is not a constant reoccurrence. It requires perpetual reoccurrence. So basically, if anomalies are too great that the adaptive function, through perpetually being active and inhibiting desire, is not able to update the instincts, then what will occur is that desire, as a consequence of its perpetual inhibition, will grow in strength. And so this conflict of instincts will reach a greater and greater point. This is because the threat of not pursuing desire will reach such a level that it will override, or at least compete with, the danger or the threat which results in pursuing desire in a maladaptive state, in a state in which the instincts are not sufficiently adapted, or anomalies have not been adapted to, or the instincts have not been adapted in a manner which facilitates the avoidance of anomalies, which as we said, means threatening objects. So, through the suffering or the inhibitory response becoming the normative state, this, and thus, as we already went over, pain or suffering is the same thing as a conflicting of instincts, because its function is to inhibit desire fundamentally. If it overrides desire, then it will inhibit it, and then this will eventually lead to the organism escaping the scenario which caused this conflict of instincts, and then adapting through unconsciousness, through sleep, which is the logical conclusion of the instinct of self-preservation. In that state in which suffering is the normative mode of being, which is a conflict of instincts, the adaptive function will continue into waking life. So let's do a slight reframing here. This is a bit of a subtle point, but I think it's important. So the normative state of being is basically, as a rule, desire or pleasure, the motivation to seek desire. When we say that the instinct of self-preservation or pain has become the normative state for humanity, what we basically mean is through the prolongation of this conflict of instinct into waking life, which is the infiltration of the adaptive function into waking life, thus inhibiting the instincts, it'll present an image to consciousness of a negative or an unsuccessful playing out of the instincts. And this is what causes an inhibition of desire. So this image presents itself as a memory or fantasy. So it'll use memory of the instance which has not been processed by the adaptive function on consciousness, as the means by which to inhibit the instincts. So it'll re-trigger the instinct of self-preservation through presenting this image to consciousness. But as this conflict of instincts reaches a greater and greater extent, as desire becomes more and more paramount, memory transfigures itself into fantasy. Now, the reason why fantasy is more associated with the fulfillment of desire than memory is because basically through memory, through recalling prior experience, which is what the adaptive function is doing, it's simulating, as in dreams, it's simulating the evolutionary landscape to consciousness, and thus causing the instincts to act in accordance with its assessment of the fundamental nature of the evolutionary landscape. Its assessment of that situation has been that the fundamental instinctual response should be the instinct of self-preservation, because memory or recent prior experience insinuates to it that the most likely course of action in pursuing desire is failure or death. So all it has to do is reorient prior experience, relay prior experience to consciousness in order to achieve its result. But when desire becomes so integral, the adaptive function will attempt to generate a new pattern of behavior. It cannot rely on memory, it cannot rely on prior experience to reorient desire, because the prior experience which would be necessary in order to cause the instincts to act in accordance with what is implied by such prior experience is lacking in order to allow desire to overcome the instinct of self-preservation. So what it's doing is basically evolving a new pattern of behavior, and that's what is taking place during fantasy. It's a fiction. It's the adaptive function using its creative capacity. And so basically what the adaptive function is doing is it's generating new patterns of behavior
through overcoming this memory through fantasy, through a fictionalized depiction of prior experience in which the error is avoided or a new pattern of behavior is generated. It's generating new patterns of behavior, not in accordance with constantly occurring anomaly, but with proximal anomaly. Something that might have gone wrong once or twice, which is preventing it from pursuing desire. And the reason for this is that when the adaptive function is active during waking life, it will be at the greatest possible extremity of intensity. The conflict of instincts will be at the greatest possible level, because in order for desire to be inhibited during waking life, which is the time when desire mustn't be fulfilled, that's when the greatest possible necessity for the pursuit of desire is, and therefore the adaptive function will then be capable of generating patterns of behavior in accordance with anomalies that have not perpetually reoccurred. The issue with this is that there is a greater degree of risk involved in taking in generating patterns of behavior in accordance with anomalies that have not perpetually occurred. So to summarize what we just went over, if the adaptive function is incapable of rectifying anomalies during consciousness due to their spontaneity, and thus an organism is caught in a state of a conflict of instincts during waking life, the adaptive function will take over and rectify this conflict in accordance with anomalies that have not constantly reoccurred. The reason for this is that during unconsciousness, it relies on constant recurrence of anomalies because it has to recreate its image of the adaptive landscape just from its repository of prior experience. But during waking life, the adaptive function can use sensory data of the immediate objects in its vicinity, and then serve to adapt the organism in accordance with what is in its immediate surroundings. So as we already went over before, in the normative state, when one is in one's familiar landscape, desire is triggered because desire is associated with familiarity. The further you go away from desire, the stronger that the instinct of self-preservation becomes. But when the normative function is inhibited by the instinct of self-preservation due to a lacking of adaptation during unconsciousness, the desire that's usually associated with familiarity will be counteracted with an image of the unprocessed anomaly, which is memory. Then the adaptive function can use the memory, which is used as the inhibitory image of desire, as its empirical material to generate a new pattern of behavior. So given the fact that the instincts for humanity and the external world aren't precisely reconcilable, which is to say that the automated manifestation of the instincts is insufficient to ensure survival due to our vulnerability, which is to say that anomalies have occurred so much throughout evolutionary history that adaptation to the external world or updating of the instincts cannot surely be left to the adaptive function operating below unconsciousness, but that the adaptive function is perpetually enters consciousness for us, or takes over consciousness. Which say a conflict of instincts or the inhibition of desire can be caused very easily. So we need to, however, reconceptualize consciousness. It's not as though one day there were just automated instincts, one day we were conscious and had some kind of unitary, autonomous will over the instincts. It's a very gradual process which is still occurring. So basically, let's make a conceptual distinction here. We've been using the term consciousness in two manners. So consciousness, which we have just got to now, is the adaptive function operating during waking life. The other consciousness is just like awareness, something that animals possess. So basically, what occupies consciousness, pre-conscious consciousness, animal consciousness, awareness, what occupies awareness determines their behavioral constitution of the organism. So preconscious awareness is the perceptual apparatus of an organism, its observation of the external world. That's what remains constant about preconscious life. But it's just subject to different instincts depending on what occupies its attention. So this isn't different for humanity. It's just that since the adaptive function is ever present, the objects which occupy attention aren't surely limited to the external world. But we have objects or fantasies or images revealed to us by the adaptive function. Now, through awareness or preconscious perception or whatever, becoming fixed, through it perpetually encountering these internally generated images by the adaptive function, that is what gives rise to consciousness. Or consciousness is the emancipation of awareness from its pure entrenchment within the external world and becoming absorbed by internally generated images. Now, the adaptive function was interpreted as the deity, as God. The reason why the adaptive function wouldn't be interpreted as something internal, something produced by the organism, by the psyche, is because as consciousness was first being given birth, obviously there was no conception psyche. There was not even a conception itself. There was just instincts, and then suddenly it's aware of images emanating from something that is not synonymous with the external world. So this is interpreted as a spiritual world, and that which presents these images to consciousness, to pre-consciousness, to awareness, which gives rise to consciousness, is interpreted as a deity or a god. So being that there was no conception of self when consciousness was first being given rise to, that could be referred to as that which produces the images which enter consciousness, which are of a different nature to the external empirical world, and which because of that fact, it's interpreted as something external to the self and external to the world, and because of its purposive nature, because it gives the organism solutions to problems that which it is unable to overcome. It's conceived of as purposive and alive, and as something to be obeyed. So this is basically to say that you are not the adaptive function. Let's take a few steps back here. So you are not the adaptive function. You are, phenomenologically speaking, the image which the adaptive function reveals to you of yourself. The sense of self is something gradually gained throughout life. It's ultimately an internalization of how you're treated by other people, or the image of yourself that you gain from experience in general, but primarily the experiences of that you with other people, of other people insinuating things about you, which you then internalize and act out. This image of the self is created by the adaptive function, with evolutionary and the manner in which the image of yourself is presented to you has evolutionary underpinnings. So it serves a particular purpose the same way any other image created by the adaptive function serves to rectify conflictive instincts. You refer self-consciousness as referring back to whatever image you have. When you're conceptualizing yourself, you are referring back to all prior experiences to see what worked in those experiences as a potential analogy for the evolutionary requirements of the present. That is the image of the self we have. We don't know the self in itself the same way we don't know the thing in itself from the Kantian perspective. So the self is what you are in essence, rather than what a part of you insinuates to consciousness, what the unconscious reveals to consciousness. For evolutionary utility, what you are not as that, but as a thing in itself is unknowable. It's something it's not something. It isn't you. What you are, in essence, is not you. Not anything that you could possibly conceptualize as you. So, this is the unknown, that this self in itself is God. That which is eternally unknowable. And that is an adaptive function. I'm saying the self, I'm calling the self in itself the adaptive function. So we've delineated the distinction between pre-conscious consciousness, animal consciousness, possession by the instincts, and a self-consciousness, which only humans possess, which is basically synonymous with the adaptive function. It basically is the adaptive function. So consciousness as such, consciousness is basically perception, the perception of objects. So pre-animal consciousness is what is termed by Levi-Bruhl participation mystique. So the self and the world aren't distinct, which is to say attention is basically just absorbed in the objects of the external world. It's purely absorbed with the successful acting out of the instincts, the accumulation of the objects of desire. Then possession by the adaptive function, the higher form of consciousness, is basically where attention is absorbed by internally generated images, which serve to update or evolve the instincts. And in that form of consciousness, the self and the world appear distinct. So the purpose or the function of the operation of the adaptive function is the reconciliation of anomalies. When anomalies occurred, the world and the self are both analyzed to see where the mismatch occurs, and either the one or the other is rectified in accordance. This is thought. That is what thought is. Thought is thought. You only think when you have to think, and when you have to think is where there's a mismatch between the instincts and evolutionary necessity. So images are produced by the adaptive function of prior experience, and consciousness serves to it serves to investigate the origin of the anomaly through the experience, and thus rectify that anomaly for the sake of the future, which is the same thing as an updating or evolution of the instincts. Now, we can't get out of this prejudice as modern people that we are the thinker of our thoughts. But for primitives, thought came to you. Thought is something that you are the recipient of, or like God provides the thoughts to you. This is psychologically more accurate. The reason why I think we tend to think we think our thoughts. It's that for modern Western people, we've evolved so much past our natural situation, which is to say, we've become less and less identified with the instincts. We've become less and less identified with the participation mystique form of consciousness, and more identified with the adaptive function. So there's a split, there's a psychological split going on there. Which is to say, our consciousness has become more and more developed. That's the same thing as to say we identify more and more with the adaptive function. We still identify more with the animal, with the instincts, with animal consciousness, much greater than we do with the adaptive function. Attention, for the most part, is usually absorbed by the external world, because for the most part, the instincts and the world are in alignment. But anytime anyone is engaged in serious reflection, you're possessed by the adaptive function. So basically, throughout time, as a historical development, we've become further and further away from identification of the instincts and more identified with the adaptive function. So the conditions which propel this evolutionary development is what we're going to go into next. Before we get into that, however, I think we'll whip out some good old Nietzsche once again, as that's what everyone is here for anyway. So, the Gay Science, passage 354 of The Genius of the Species. This will hopefully give us a little bit of a framework for this next part of the lecture. So, the problem of consciousness, or more properly, of becoming self-conscious, comes before us only when we begin to grasp the extent to which we could get along without it. Physiology and ethnology have made a start in this direction, though it has taken them 2 centuries to catch up with Leibniz's prescient suspicions in this regard. For we could in fact feel, will, and remember. We could likewise act in every sense of the word, and nevertheless none of this ever entered consciousness, as we say figuratively. The whole of life could be possible without seeing itself in a mirror, so to speak, just as even now the greater portion of this life goes on without this mirroring, and indeed even much of our cognitive, affective, and volitional life, however offensive this may sound to an older philosopher. So why have consciousness at all, when it is in the main superfluous? Now it seems to me, if you will listen to my answer, and its perhaps extravagant speculation, that subtlety and strength of consciousness are always proportional to a man's or animal's capacity for communication. This capacity being in turn proportional to the need for communication, by which I do not mean that the individual who is master at communicating and making his needs known is necessarily the most dependent upon others for the satisfaction of these needs. But it seems to me to be with respect to whole races and successions of generations, where need and hardship have compelled man to communicate with and understand one another quickly and subtly. A surplus of the power and art of communication finally exists. A fortune, so to speak, has been accumulated which waits upon an heir to squander it lavishly. The so-called artists are these heirs, as are orators, preachers, and authors. All of them men who come at the end of a long succession, epigons in the best sense of the word, and, as I said, squanderers by their very nature. This observation is correct, then I may proceed to the conjecture that consciousness has developed only under the pressure of the need for communication. That from the very beginning it has been necessary and useful only between man and man, especially between those commanding and those obeying, and has only developed in proportion to its utility. Consciousness is actually nothing but a network of connections between man and man. Only as such did it have to develop. A reclusive or predatory man would not have needed it. The fact that our actions, thoughts, emotions, and movements even come into consciousness, at least a part of them, is the consequence of a terrible and prolonged imperative to which man was subject. As the most endangered animal, he needed help and protection. He needed his kin. He had to express his hardship, to know how to make himself intelligible. For all this, he needed consciousness, first and foremost. Thus, he had to know for himself what he lacked, how he felt, and what he thought. For, to say it again, like every living creature, man thinks all the time, but does not know it. The thinking of which we are conscious is only the smallest part of the whole, and I might add, the most superficial part, the worst part. For this conscious thinking takes place in words, that is, in the science of communication, and it is in this form that the origin of consciousness is disclosed.
In short, the development of language and the development of consciousness, not of reason, rather only of reason becomes self-consciousness, go hand in hand. Let us add that it is not only language that serves as a bridge between man and man, but also the facial expressions, circumstances, and gestures. What is more, our consciousness of our sense impressions, our ability to stabilize them and project them outside ourselves, has increased to the same extent as our need for communicating them to others through signs. The man who devises signs is at the same time the man who is always more acutely self-conscious. It is only as a social animal that man has learned to become conscious of himself. He's doing so still and is doing so more and more. Obviously, my idea is that consciousness is actually not a part of man's individual existence at all, but rather a part of his communal or gregarious nature, from which it follows that it is only in relation to communal and gregarious utility that it develops with any subtlety, and that consequently each of us, no matter how hard we try to understand ourselves as individuals, no matter how hard we try to follow the maxim, know thyself, will never bring into consciousness any more than what is non-individual in us, our ordinariness. That our thought itself is continually being outvoted, so to speak, by the character of consciousness, by the mandate of the genius of the species it contains, and translated back into the perspective of the herd. Without a doubt, basically all of our actions are incomparably unique, personally unique, and infinitely individual. But as soon as we translate them into consciousness, they no longer seem to be. In my opinion, this is the proper understanding of phenomenalism and perspectivism. The nature of animal consciousness implies that the world of which we are able to become conscious is only a superficial world, a world of signs, a generalized and vulgarized world. That everything which becomes conscious thereby becomes shallow, thin, relatively stupid, general, a sign, a characteristic of the herd. That all consciousness is associated with a great and fundamental corruption, falsification, superficiality, and generalization. Finally, the growth of consciousness is dangerous, and whoever lives among the most conscious Europeans even knows that it is a disease. As one might have guessed, it is not the antithesis of subject and object which concerns me here. I leave that distinction to the epistemologists who have remained entangled in the snares of grammar, the metaphysics of the people. Even less is it the antithesis of the thing itself and the phenomenon, for we do not know enough to be entitled to make a distinction, such a distinction. We have absolutely no organ for knowledge, for truth. We know, or believe, or imagine exactly as much as may be useful to us, exactly as much as promotes the interests of the human herd or species. And even what is called useful here is ultimately only what we believe to be useful, what we imagine to be useful, but perhaps is precisely the most fatal stupidity which will one day lead to our destruction. Alright, so there's a lot in that passage. But we'll just start with the idea of consciousness as evolving for the sake of gregarious utility. Now, in a scenario where humanity is greatly endangered, in which the instincts in the external world have had a vast breaking, and thus the adaptive function is ever more eminently required, emulation becomes more and more necessary. Emulation of others who have successfully overcome these breaks in instincts in the external world. Nietzsche himself says that the herd instinct, which is basically the instinct of emulation, is the strongestly developed instinct of humanity. So, as we said, the adaptive function requires as much empirical material as possible, which basically means prior experience, in order to generate new patterns of behavior. So this, included in this, is observation of others. Like, this is something that even animals are capable of observing others and replicating their actions in accordance. This is one of the most fundamental means that the adaptive function uses to update the instincts, because one individual is not capable of going through all of the experiences necessary in order to garner the experience to evolve new patterns of behavior. It relies on emulation, because partly just because the risks of exposure to experiences of conflicts of instincts, of exposure to anomaly, are of such great danger that the species would probably become extinct if the species as such could not serve as the experimental subjects rather than just purely an individual.
So through this adaptive function becoming more and more developed, our creative capacity also becomes more developed. And then this is where language comes in. Language is a form of symbol. So symbols are means of relaying. They are means of provoking images in the mind, of triggering the adaptive function in a manner which presents a reconciliation of the instincts. It provokes the image that is necessary for these instincts to evolve without the experience as such acting as the necessary precursor. So this even comes down to animals as well. Just vocal noises insinuating that predators are near, or just any kind of articulation of an animal to a group is a form of language. It's the most rudimentary form of language. It serves to trigger a certain instinctual response without the organism having actually encountered this scenario, which was necessary to cause that instinctual response. So this is the same thing with language, but it's just much more sophisticated and highly developed form. So the main difference between animal and human communication is that human consciousness is capable of channeling the adaptive function. So language, even for us, is in some sense similar to animal language in that its purpose is to cause a particular instinctual response which basically just means language is still largely used as a means by which to insinuate a course of action. It's purely based on practical immediacy. But at the more highly sophisticated level where the adaptive function comes into play, what we're doing is essentially relaying our maps of reality to each other. So this is like, this basically means we are serving to evolve, to cause an evolution or adaptation of the instincts for other people through language. So this is why Nietzsche comes from the perspective that the purpose of consciousness itself, the purpose of making our map of reality conscious, is for the sake of articulating it and sharing it with others. So basically, all language is symbols, communal experience that are used to fill in the gaps of personal experience, to allow an evolution of the instincts. So basically, this is a bit of a difficult idea, but it's like the image created by the adaptive function. What we mean by it is basically the image created by the adaptive function serves to cause the same kind of adaptation that takes place during dreams. The image provoked by the adaptive function by the use of language causes a reconfiguration of the objects which are associated with the instincts. This is what we mean by an updating of a map of reality. So the thing, we will not agree with Nietzsche in saying that consciousness only exists for the purpose of communication. So it's true that consciousness is like an internalization of the group. It exists as a relation between man and man, and it could not exist without that fact, surely for the reason that it's necessary to outsource adaptation for the existence of consciousness. But the root of the existence of consciousness is the necessity for the adaptive function to correct for maladaptive instincts. And communication is only a means by which to achieve that end. But it's not the cause or only reason for language. It's a necessary precursor for consciousness. It's a necessary precursor for consciousness, but it's not the fundamental root of it. So, what is implied by the the fact that the contents of consciousness is an internalization of a group mentality. So this basically means that the evolution of consciousness is inextricably tied to the necessity for a conforming of behavior between people. And that's what this internalization of a group conception of reality serves. That's what the contents of consciousness is, according to Nietzsche at least. So this is partly for the reason I've already said, for the necessity to outsource adaptation, but on a perhaps even more fundamental level, it's the evolution of consciousness has been in order for consciousness to evolve it, and therefore for the species to continue throughout time. The necessity for greater and greater, more sophisticated group cooperation has been a means by which to remove ourselves from conditions where possession by the instincts is necessary, and allow conditions more and more where the adaptive function can take over consciousness. This is for the reason that, as we said, the instincts, the automated manifestation of instincts is not sufficient to ensure survival. So consciousness needs to become more and more a factor of influence. So a necessity occurred where group conflict, dominance-based conflict had to be reduced. In order to, because that's one of the primary reasons. Better group cooperation allows for the creation of environments where possession of the instincts isn't necessary. This is the emergence of the necessity for civilization. In regards to, so that would be an extrication from the existential threat of the environment from predators and privation and whatnot. But in order for group cooperation as well, there needed to be a reduction of status-based conflict. So we'll just go in a little bit into some relatively basic evolutionary biology here regarding dominance hierarchies. So the individual that is capable of reaching the top of the dominance hierarchy possesses dominant characteristics, which we'll term primary attributes. So these primary attributes are basically the result of the successful embodiment of desire, the successful integration of desire as the fundamental instinctual response to its environment, to its social environment as well. So these primary attributes are characterized by dominance, strength, indifference to suffering. That's an important one. And then these secondary attributes, which are the result of the will to self-preservation, pain being its fundamental response to its social environment, to dominance disputes, which are traits associated with compassion, sensitivity to suffering, generosity, gregarious characteristics like that, but a greater degree of weakness than and sensitivity to suffering, as we said, compared to primary attributes. So basically what happens is, since the top of the hierarchy for the most part gets to reproduce, the one who's most capable of adopting primary attributes, the offspring or the new generation, its fundamental instinctual response to its environment, its initial normative state, is these primary attributes, which is why we call them primary attributes. It's only through the dominance disputes and the formation of hierarchy that secondary attributes are adopted as a secondary adaptive strategy. Now, it's not as though just the top of the hierarchy gets to embody these primary attributes, and then everyone else embodies secondary attributes. It's a matter of degree. So it's not as though there's just the alpha male and then there's all just alpha male and then just dom and then just subordinates. It's like in relation to the top of the hierarchy, everyone needs to embody these secondary attributes, but below them, below like the betas, they get to occupy primary attributes and relation to those below them. So basically, only the top of the hierarchy gets to possess these primary attributes completely, and only the bottom of the hierarchy must only possess these secondary attributes. Everything between is a matter of degree. Even the top hierarchy needs to embody these secondary attributes to a certain extent in order to not be overthrown by those below them, because those below them have to be somewhat satisfied with their access to nourishment and reproduction and whatnot. So basically how this works is that whenever there's a sign of weakness in the top of the hierarchy, or the top of the hierarchy is too tyrannical, dominance disputes ensue. Now, with humanity, with the necessity for increased cooperation, there has been a pronounced need for these secondary attributes. Now, this is tied up with the idea that we have a greater sensitivity to suffering, or that the normative state is not necessarily pleasure, for the reason that the instincts aren't perfectly adapted to the environment. So, from the get-go, we are in a need of outsourcing adaptation. So, in order to prevent these dominance disputes and facilitate greater cooperation, and therefore facilitate greater outsourcing of adaptation through communication, yes, there need to be the leader has to embody the secondary, find a middle ground between these secondary and primary attributes. So basically, an embodiment of everything that is necessary for a leader, which is strength, and strength, dominance, ability to lead, all of that, but also with virtues of the secondary attributes, which is like compassion and loyalty and a lack of tyrannical activity. So through the leader adopting these attributes, a lacking of finding a middle ground between these two conflicting modes of being, dominance disputes are hypothetically reduced. Because the conditions which cause dominance disputes, either show of weakness in the leader or tyranny, are avoided. And then the leader serves as serves to insinuate to everyone else the mode of being which must be to be emulated. As we said, for humanity, the instincts aren't sufficient, so we rely more and more upon emulation of others in order to be correctly adapted to reality. So then emulation of the leader becomes absolutely paramount, and this is the means by which dominance disputes are overcome. So the leader then is the individual who has gone through this conflict of instincts between pleasure and pain, and the adaptive function has created a mode of being in response to this conflict of instincts, which he then embodies, and then everyone else does not have to go through this conflict of instincts, but just has to emulate the leader because he's already gone through that process of adaptation. So now here we need to I need to give you a kind of idea of Jungian archetypes to a certain extent. Jung has been a kind of an implicit influence to this entire analysis, but here it's necessary to explicitly talk about his ideas to a certain extent. So an archetype is basically So let's go back a bit. We already went over the fact that the nature of consciousness is defined by that which occupies its attention. So it's possessed by the instincts if it's possessed by the objects in the external world, for the most part. And it's possessed by the adaptive function if it is possessed by internally generated images, which are used to evolve the instincts for the most part. So Jung's idea of an archetype is basically these images produced by the psyche which cause an adaptation of the instincts aren't necessarily just based on the prior experience of the individual. So it's partly that. But underlying that, these images which are used to update the instincts get inherited. They get almost encoded into the psychic substructure of the organism, the collective unconscious. So basically, these images, so we went over the idea that reality is fundamentally an instinctual match to evolutionary necessity, and not a match between your abstract reality and the external world, even though it's also that, because that is necessary in order to facilitate a alignment between the instincts and evolutionary necessity. But fundamentally, it's the instincts and evolutionary necessity which determine the nature of reality. So when a particular instinctual response is necessitated by the environment, the reason why the adaptive function presents an image to consciousness needs to present an image to consciousness in order to cause that instinctual response is because the nature of the behavioral constitution of the organism is dependent on the objects which occupy its attention. Now, if these objects are not, the objects which are necessary to cause the most adaptive instinctual response to its environment is not in its external vicinity. It's not in the external world. The adaptive function will produce that image internally to cause that instinctual response. And that image is, we could call an archetype. So the image is an object which causes, the archetypal image is basically it's a representation of an instinctual response. I don't think we can explain it any better than that, because there is a correlation between that which occurs internally as a mode of being, as an instinct, and that which occurs externally. So it's difficult to draw the distinction between the object as the archetype and the internal instinctual response. It's the dynamic relationship between the two which constitutes the archetype. So this conflict between primary and secondary attributes, between the suppression of the desire to engage in group dominance-based conflict for the benefits which accrue from being at the top of the hierarchy or climbing the hierarchy, while simultaneously the adoption of the attributes, the positive attributes which come from the top being high in the hierarchy, strength of character and whatnot, and a lack of sensitivity to suffering. When these moments come about, when these conflicts occur, this is the social manifestation of the conflict between desire and self-preservation, means pleasure and pain. So that's the fundamental instinctual basis of this conflict. When in those scenarios, the adaptive function will present an image of the top of the hierarchy, of someone, of whatever the psyche of adaptive function formulates as the mode of being which embodies the successful overcoming of this conflict and synthesis of these two modes of being. This is before the reason that your behavioral constitution is determined by the objects in your environment. This is ever more true of the people you're around. You mirror the mode of being that is presented to you by other people. So if you are presented by an image of the mode of the ideal or evolutionarily necessary mode of being, this causes an instinctual response which mirrors your perception of that object and allows you to embody it. So if we are going to take the idea of the Jungian archetype seriously, like an inheritance of this, so the archetype, the image that is formulated by the adaptive function, which is an archetypal image, is in part the result of its picking up on your individual experience, but it's also partly something inherited by the experiences of ancestors. So if we're going to take that idea from an evolutionary point of view, let's say the top of the hierarchy, the individual who is capable of embodying this compromise between these modes of being is perpetually throughout countless generations, an untold number of years, perhaps so long that it predates the emergence of consciousness, it predates humanity, or goes back to the very inception of human consciousness. So through that, the psyche ends up inaugurating, or this image of the ideal mode of being gets inherited into the psyche, and then at the times of conflict of instincts, when this mode of being is required, it is presented by the adaptive function. Now, this mode of being, this archetype of the successful overcoming of this successful compromise between primary and secondary attributes, is conflated with the adaptive function. So God, the deity, is said to possess these attributes because the image which the adaptive function presents to the individual as the ideal mode of being and the ideal mode of being as such are conflated conceptually. And so God is this ideal dominant top of the hierarchy individual who is insinuating things to you about how you should act. So throughout time, basically, there's a gradual increase in the necessity for secondary attributes to be adopted and a decrease in necessity for these primary attributes. Now, this is because these primary attributes are associated with a lack of sensitivity to suffering. So this means to your own suffering, but it also means to the suffering of others. So this is necessary when you're more and more exposed to danger, when possession by the instincts is more and more necessary, when you're in more and more of a state of conflict with other tribes. But as we get to a larger and larger growth of civilization, these primary attributes become more and more dangerous because these primary attributes are trigger the mode of being which causes one to engage in dominance-based conflict. So by the time we reach Christianity, we reach such an accentuation of the necessity for secondary attributes. But this is not just a social phenomenon, this gradual evolution from primary to secondary attributes in the mode of being, which is represented by God. This is the adaptive function itself, adapting the mode of being which is required by evolutionary necessity. It's itself adapting that image to the evolving requirements of evolutionary necessity which occur with the growth of civilization. So this isn't just some arbitrary result of social circumstances, although those social circumstances influence the adaptive function, but it's not a conscious manufacturing of people in power which causes an evolution of the God image. It's an unconscious process in the psyche which is presenting this God image to consciousness in a more and more evolved state. So by Christianity, we reach a complete pinnacle of the embodiment of secondary attributes. Now, this is still a compromise between primary and secondary attributes, because the ideal of Christ is a sacrifice, a complete overcoming of the instinct of self-preservation, of pain, of a complete sacrifice, a complete sacrifice of the instinct for self-preservation, a complete submission to pain and willingness to embody it to the utmost extent. So that is
associated with primary attributes. But everything else basically is secondary attributes. It's meekness, turn the other cheek. Everything about Christianity is about not engaging in dominance-based conflict. That is the pinnacle of the Christian ideal. But as a result, we become more and more of embodying that ideal, becoming more and more associated with that ideal. We become more and more sensitive to suffering. Because, as we said, suffering is the instinct which insinuates a restriction against the pursuit of desire. But when desire is successfully or appropriately embodied, is successfully and vehemently integrated into the behavioral constitution of the organism, there's less of a sensitivity to suffering. So as a result, we become more and more sensitive to suffering, and thus we start to question the value of existence itself, because we're more and more possessed by the instinct of self-preservation, and do not get the pleasure and the affirmation of life which is associated with the successful pursuit of desire, which is inextricably tied to dominance-based conflict, and the successful climbing up the dominance hierarchy, which is tied to that. So Nietzsche's idea is that, basically in a very simplified manner, that this is the reason why Christianity collapsed, and why Christianity is life-denying, because it's fundamentally predicated on the instinct which inhibits desire, and desire is the life-affirming mode of being. So too much of an embodiment of these secondary attributes and a neglecting of the primary caused the adaptive function to reject the idea which was once necessary in the classical era due to the compensatory nature of the adaptive function in regards to the environment. So a new ideal has to come about in which these primary attributes are more successfully or thoroughly integrated.
So this idea of the insufficiency of the Christian ideal for evolutionary utility is connected to this idea of the will to truth, Christianity's emphasis on the will to truth, undermining itself. So going to this idea, we're going to read a passage from Genealogy of Morals. It's passage 27 from Essay 3. Enough, enough. Let us leave these curiosities and complexities of the modern spirit, which excite as much laughter as disgust. Our problem can certainly do without them. The problem of the meaning of the ascetic ideal. What has it got to do with yesterday or today? Those things shall be handled by me more thoroughly and severely in another connection, under the title A Contribution to the History of European Nihilism. I refer for this to a work which I am preparing. The Will to Power, an attempt at a transvaluation of all values. The only reason why I come to allude to it here is this. The ascetic ideal has at times, even the most intellectual sphere, only one real kind of enemies and damages. These are the comedians of this ideal, for they awake mistrust. Everywhere otherwise, where the mind is at work seriously, powerfully, and without counterfeiting, it dispenses altogether now with an ideal. The popular expression for this abstinence is atheism, with the exception of the will for truth. But this will, this remnant of an ideal, is, if you will believe me, that ideal itself in its severest and cleverest formulation, esoteric through and through, stripped of all its outworks, and consequently not so much its remnant as its kernel. Unqualified honest atheism, and its air only do we breathe, we, the most intellectual men of this age, is not opposed to that ideal, to the extent that it appears to be. It is rather one of the final phases of its evolution, one of its syllogisms and pieces of inherent logic. It is the awe-inspiring catastrophe of a 2,000-year training in truth, which finally forbids itself the lie of the belief in God. The same course of development in India, quite independently, and consequently of some demonstrated value, the same ideal driving to the same conclusion, the decisive point reached 500 years before the European era, or more precisely at the time of Buddha. It started in the Sankhya philosophy, and then this was popularized through Buddha and made into a religion.
What, I put the question with all strickenness, has really triumphed over the Christian God? The answer stands in my Gay Science, aphorism 357. The Christian morality itself, the idea of truth taken as it was with increasing seriousness, the confessor subtlety of the Christian conscience, translated and sublimated into the scientific conscience, into intellectual cleanness at any price, regarding nature as though it were a proof of the goodness and guardianship of God, interpreting history in honor of a divine reason and as a constant proof of a moral order of the world and a moral teleology, explaining our own personal experiences as pious men have for long enough explained them, as though every arrangement, every nod, every single thing were invented and sent out of love for the salvation of the soul. All this is now done away with. All this has the conscience against it, and is regarded by every subtler conscience as disreputable, dishonorable, as lying, feminism, weakness, cowardice. By means of this severity, if by means of anything at all, we are, in sooth, good Europeans, and heirs of Europe's longest and bravest self-mastery. All great things go to ruin by reason of themselves. By reason of an act of self-dissolution, so wills the law of life, the law of necessary self-mastery, even in the essence of life. Ever is the lawgiver finally exposed to the cry, submit to the law that you yourself have made. In thus wise did Christianity go to ruin as a dogma, through its own morality. In thus wise must Christianity again go to ruin today as a morality. We are standing on the threshold of this event. After Christian truthfulness has drawn one conclusion after the other, it finally draws its strongest conclusion, its conclusion against itself. This, however, happens when it puts the question, what is the meaning of every will for truth? And here again do I touch on my problem, on our problem, my unknown friends. For as yet I know of no friends. What sense has our whole being, if it does not mean that in ourselves that will for truth has come to its own consciousness as a problem? By reason of this attainment of self-consciousness on the part of the will for truth, morality from henceforward, there is no doubt about it, goes to pieces. This is that great 100-act play that is reserved for the next 2 centuries of Europe, the most terrible, the most mysterious, and perhaps also the most hopeful of all plays. So, this will for truth coming to its own consciousness as a problem. In order to understand this, let's go back over some of this biological idea of truth. So, the instincts condition the way in which we see the world. This is one of Nietzsche's greatest discoveries. So we can think about it like consciousness, that which attempts to analyze the nature of reality, that the will for truth, so to speak, is a product of the instincts, of the behavioral apparatus of the organism, and serves to redirect the instincts. It is subservient to them. It serves to adapt the instincts to reality. So, think about it like this. We do not just uncover the nature of the way the truth that our conception of reality evolves. It's not just through randomly throughout time. We just rationally see that our previous worldviews were insufficient. That's not we have to first recognize what gives rise to the impetus by which we take the measures in which we develop our conception of reality is an impetus or intuition of the practical insufficiency of our previous conception of reality. So, and this isn't something founded on intuition, not on a rational conclusion. We come to rational conclusions after an intuition gives rise to the impetus by which to perform the necessary intellectual labor by which to uncover the nature of reality. So, from this perspective, then, we need to, this will to truth coming consciousness, the problem is to say that our conception of reality is not something absolute and indisputable, but rather the way we see the world has been shrouded or obscured or is conditioned by whatever this adaptive function operating below consciousness assesses to be the most evolutionarily beneficial way in which for consciousness to apprehend reality in order for it to achieve its outcome, which is propagation of life, or the acting out of particular patterns of behavior by which the species is propagated. So this will to truth, which Nietzsche states is something that has been inaugurated into us from Christianity, implies that the particular Christian conception of reality has been taken as absolute, and any contradiction against it has been completely and utterly there've been extreme measures against our capacity to make any contradiction towards it. Hence its immense emphasis based on heresy and the consequences which ensue from that. So this will for truth is a pinnacleization of it's like a culmination of this evolutionary process in regards to the evolution of the ideal which underpins our behavior, the idea of the God image, evolving to a point in which it embodies these secondary attributes to like this utmost extent, in which subservience is held as the highest good. Subservience to the Christian ideal, not necessarily just subservience to authority, but that ends up resulting in subservience to authority if the authority is the representative, or supposedly the representative of the Christian ideal. But anyway, so if the Christian ideal represents the utmost culmination of the idealization of these secondary attributes and a demonization of these primary attributes of egoism and the pursuit of desire, this is the reason why the will for truth in regards to Christianity had to be such an immense emphasis placed on it. Because if you are not possessed by the instincts, which are associated with like the preordained or automated patterns of behavior by which desire is pursued, or one is capable of climbing the dominance hierarchy, which inherently involves dominant space disputes, if that is branded as evil, then we become much more reliant upon the culture or other people in order to tell us how we should be acting. This is an inevitable result of a dissociation from the instincts. So the will to truth then, in regards to the Christian conception, is the will to see reality in a manner which serves to facilitate group cooperation. And thus, as an extension of that, facilitates our capacity to outsource adaptation. And so this is like the reason for confession. This is what he's talking about, the confessor's subtlety of the Christian ethos. Confession can be thought about, or like just the manner in which the confession was like a mechanism of internalizing this Christian morality. It's like making it's a sense bringing to consciousness internal or psychological phenomena which precedes action, which precedes the pursuit of desire, as a means by which to subject it to this gregarious conception of reality and thus suppress it or channel it in a way which serves gregarious interests. This is the Christian guilt. This is what gives rise to this Christian guilt, or which is mythologized as the idea of original sin, arguably. So, the effect that Christianity had through its emphasis on this will for truth is a accentuation of the influence of consciousness, of self-consciousness over action, as opposed to the instincts. So this is a bit of a complicated point, but we defined earlier consciousness, self-consciousness, as this adaptive function. It's like rationality, but the adaptive function only serves to generate new patterns of behavior, new ideals, to rectify the conflicting of the instincts, the inadequacy of the instincts, through situations of internal conflict. But Christianity, what Christianity serves to do is to prevent people from the pursuit of desire, which is necessary in order to go through these conflicts of instincts, to oneself discover the inadequacy of the instincts and then allow the adaptive function to generate patterns of behavior. So through the undervaluation of the instincts, which is the result of Christian morality, and thus the corresponding necessity or influence of the adaptive function. The adaptive function requires gregarious symbols, gregarious prescribed patterns of behavior in order to act. So we could use some consciousness here. Consciousness we can think of like rationality, the voice in your head. This is what we mean by the adaptive function generates internal images. You could interpret the voice in your head, which you call you, the ego, as an internal image which is responding to reality and generating patterns of behavior in accordance, serving to rectify the inadequacy of the instincts. So we've become more and more identified with the ego. Ancient people saw themselves as a plurality. They recognized they were driven by unconscious forces, the instincts. Then with Christianity, this is whittled down to good and evil. So there are the instincts which are approved of God, and there are instincts which are antithetical to God. According to our conception, God is the mode of being of adaptive advantage. So you're pleasing the nature of reality. You're acting in accordance with the mode of being by which the species will be able to propagate itself. If you are embodying good, if you're acting in accordance with Christ, and the reverse is evil, is the influence of Satan. Now, through our adaptation to this prescribed moral ethos, we are no longer participate in internal conflicts. So our behavior becomes to some extent automatized because of our internalization of these prescribed patterns of behavior. We've adapted to this suppression of the instincts and to subordinating our existence towards acting in accordance with the well-being of the community. So as a result of this, we no longer recognize the plurality in ourselves, or evil has become unconscious within us. We only identify with the aspect of ourself which conforms with this good, because we do not identify with desire, which is identified with evil. So then eventually these symbols, which once served to represent
accurately represent the psychological landscape lose their symbolic weight. We are no longer able to relate to them. So then we end up eventually with scientific materialism. We recognize that these group symbols become so rigorously codified and internalized that we become so reliant on them in regards to our conception of reality, that we eventually recognize their incommensurability with the nature of the empirical world. So Nietzsche terms Christianity a slave morality. So he divides morality into two different forms, essentially. So there's a master morality and a slave morality. So the master morality is basically constituted by these primary attributes. So like strength, self-sufficiency, oneself being the author of one's own actions. One not living in accordance with what other people prescribe to you as what is good and bad, but oneself. What is good is what facilitates one striving towards one's own ideal, and what is bad is what inhibits that. And then the master morality, then the slave morality, which is founded on compassion, meekness. It's basically a morality of subservience, living in accordance with an established. So what is good is what is harmlessness, and what is evil is being harmful. So basically, this slave morality could be seen as being founded upon the instinct of self-preservation. It's fundamentally oriented towards the avoidance of suffering, the minimization of suffering. The problem. This eventually, however, results in nihilism, because the more you orient your life around the avoidance of suffering, the more your life ends up constituted by suffering, because the instinct of self-preservation becomes more and more powerful, becomes stronger. So suffering becomes to constitute your existence more and more. More things cause suffering, and the things which cause suffering cause a great degree of suffering. As a result of this suppressed state of desire, as a result of this taming of the species, we end up in nihilism, a dissatisfaction with the very structure of existence. This is a result of the death of God, because of the symbols which once, or beliefs, the archetypal symbols which once allowed us to be satisfied with such an existence, such as like heaven, hell, and the kingdom of God. So archetypal images, meaning these aren't belief systems created by leaders in order to keep the population in control. These are images produced by the adaptive function in order to redirect the instincts, cause an evolution of the instincts. But anyway, they've lost their symbolic significance, meaning that the patterns of behavior which they produce are no longer sufficient for the evolution of the species. So Nietzsche's solution to this problem of nihilism is his idea of the Übermensch, or the Superman, the Overman. And so what the Übermensch represents fundamentally is for one's life to not be predicated on a purely affirmative mode of being. So this implies not being restricted by moral confines. Again, morality, this, or at least in regards to this Christian or modern incarnation of it, is found in self-preservation. So the willingness, its good is the avoidance of suffering towards yourself and others, but the achievement of greatness may inherently produce suffering, and the life-affirming instinct is being negated and suppressed. One is being inculcated with a bad conscience, and any impetus towards life, towards affirmation, is being internally suppressed by the self-preservation instinct, if that is what your existence is fundamentally predicated upon. So the affirmative mode of being would be, no, your existence is to strive towards becoming the greatest version of yourself you possibly can, towards becoming completely self-sufficient and resilient.
So it's, however, the extent to which we would be able to realize this ideal is not self-evident. After this 2,000 years of this inundation of so-called slave morality, it's not self-evident the social conditions which we've produced or the current state of our psychological evolution is compatible with such an ideal. Like, for instance, Carl Jung interpreted Nietzsche's philosophy as embodiment of Wotan, which is a war god. Nietzsche thought his philosophy was embodiment of Dionysus, which is the wine god, god of ecstasy, the god of sensuality, the god of becoming one with the instincts, with nature, with the community. But the emphasis on self-improvement and resilience, and the disparagement of weakness and cowardliness, which is constant throughout his depiction of the Übermensch, is more equivalent to Wotan, to a warlike mentality. So once we are not in a warlike scenario, once we are not perpetually by necessity being pushed to our utmost limit, in regards to what we can handle, in regards to coping with suffering, it's not self-evident that we will be able to embody a mode of being, or that the morality which he prescribes would not send us back to a situation like that. And perhaps it's too late for us to go back to a warlike mentality because of our technological development or just our psychological evolution. Perhaps it's not sustainable. We have evolved in accordance with Christian morality for a reason. It's not just arbitrary. There is an adaptive function which is adapting us to reality, and we have to act. There has to be a continuity in regards to it. This is an example of the complexity of Nietzsche's thought is that he does himself actually recognize this fact. He only brings it up once in his entire philosophy, insofar as I can tell, in Will to Power. I'll read the passage because it's very short. The mightiest and most dangerous passions of man, by means of which he most easily goes to rack and ruin, have been so fundamentally banned that mighty men themselves have either become impossible or must regard themselves as evil, harmful, and prohibited. The losses are heavy, but up to the present they have been necessary. Now, however, that a whole host of counterforces has been reared, by means of the temporary suppression of these passions, the passion for dominion, the love of change and deception, their liberation has once more become possible. They will no longer possess the old savagery. We can now allow ourselves this tame sort of barbarism. Look at our artists and statesmen. So, in that, it seems like we take this idea seriously of the evolution of consciousness. So yes, consciousness over the instincts, gaining predominance over the instincts to a great extent, has made us, by necessity, like adopt a herd or a slave morality in order to function. Because self-sufficiency is a result of possession by the instincts. But it also gives us freedom over the instincts. It gives us the capacity to not let us just be an instrument of the instincts, but perhaps for us to utilize the instincts towards our own ideal. And maybe this is what he's implying by the Übermensch. It's a synthesis between the master and slave morality. So, if we have to define what is fundamentally implied by this idea of the Übermensch, I would say that it's the idea that once we discover that there is no longer a god guiding the course of history, man must now take up this role. So this almost like elite, superhuman individuals will now determine the values which constitute the future of humanity, will now participate in shaping society or humanity in the way they feel serves to bring about the most affirmative mode of being. So this is, there is a potential problem with this formulation. So in order to analyze what the implications of this idea are, what the practical feasibility is of
the idea that we can create our own values rather than rely on God to just prescribe them for us. Let's go a bit back to some of the ideas we were going over earlier regarding the nature of the deity. So, the individual who's best able to synthesize these conflicting opposites, the mode of being which is both dominant and epitomizes strength and resilience, as well as the individual who is moral, who possesses gregarious values. So the mode of being that they epitomize is identified with the deity. So we could almost say the adaptive function, as a result of their participation in this conflict, presents a mode of being to them, an ideal, so to speak, which they then act out and embody to their greatest extent they possibly can. And so this individual is identified with the mode of being of the deity. So what this implies basically is that the deity is identified with a particular social representation of it. So the ideal that the adaptive function generates is identified with the individual who's best capable of embodying this collective ideal. So we'll say collective ideal because everyone in society participates in establishing the individual who. So we imagine there's an ideal in the collective in everyone, which serves to compensate for the fluctuations of evolutionary necessity, which provides an image of the mode of being which leads the way towards the prosperity of the species. And whoever is best capable of embodying it is the one who is best capable of climbing the hierarchy. So let's think about the idea that the slave morality is a kind of state of hibernation from this perspective. So if this withdrawing or suppression of the instincts is equivalent to a kind of state of sleep, if we define sleep as a state of adapting to reality, as we went over previously, it's being driven by the instinct of self-preservation eventually leads to a kind of sleep, by which the instincts are readapted to reality. However, the adaptive function relies upon experience for the empirical material in order to generate new patterns of behavior or a new kind of ideal. So what Christianity does is essentially puts one in a situation in which you are in this state of hibernation. The desire is in a suppressed state, but an adaptation to reality is inhibited because the experiences of a conflict of instincts, which is associated with the pursuit of desire or pleasure, is restricted. So this is associated with the idea that God is purely good. This is the idea of the Christian God. God is unquestionably good. So basically what this is implying is that the nature of the adaptive function, so as we said earlier, the God or the deity is both the adaptive function, right? So the process by which the ideal is generated, but it's also the particular representation of it, the mode of being which the adaptive function insinuates, which is of optimal evolutionary advantage. So to say that God is purely good is to associate the nature of the deity with a particular socially prescribed set of moral axioms, and any contradiction against these moral axioms is blasphemous, is delegitimized. So the effect that this has psychologically is a kind of devaluation of subjective religious or mystical experiences, because, as we said earlier, the adaptive function serves to compensate for
the for the inadequacy or the redundancy of the ideal of a particular time period. So by definition, whatever ideal the adaptive function would generate would in some way contradict the Christian formulation of God. So this causes a kind of so this is also connected to the idea that evil or sin is the result of man's transgression against God rather than a flaw in the nature of God or God's creation. So this is also associated with the idea that it was man's voluntary transgression against God which caused the fall from paradise. So inherently we existed in a state of perfection, of complete communion with God, but the fall from that state of perfection was a dissatisfaction with the nature of reality, a kind of ambition of wanting to reshape one's situation, which is associated with desire for, with the pursuit of desire, essentially. Like the idea, it gives rise unconsciously to the association that the pursuit of desire, represented by the tree of knowledge, or the pursuit of the consciousness taking up its own role in shaping its future, its reality, gives rise to an aesthetic kind of acceptance of one's situation. This is also the idea that Christ's sacrifice has already given rise to the opportunity for salvation. It's merely the acting in accordance with Christ's moral prescriptions that the kingdom of God will come about. And this kingdom of God will come about not through man's correction of his environment, of the flaws of reality, but as something that is granted from something external to the self as a result of this kind of aesthetic, this moral aestheticism, this abstinence from egoism, from pleasure. So this is a kind of one-sidedness in the religious framework of Christianity. So if there's this devaluation of inner subjective experience of deity due to its incommensurability with Christian dogma, this causes either a repression of any kind of desire or ideal which is not in conformity with Christian dogma from consciousness, or just a mere de-evaluation of it, and a sense of guilt as a result of it. So this eventually causes a further and further reliance on socially prescribed patterns of behavior, a socially prescribed ideal. If we take the idea of hibernation seriously, that people have been restricted from the natural process by which the instincts are adapted to reality, so to speak. And also this also causes an increased sense of reality, which this collective representation of reality, this causes an increased valuation or reliance upon a collective representation of reality. So these collective symbols serve to replace the natural or subjectively produced symbols by which adaptation occurs. And thus we eventually end up with scientific materialism, because from this segregation of consciousness from the instincts, from the patterns of behavior by which religious experiences are given birth. So Carl Jung offers a potential rectification of the flaws in the Christian myth. So his idea, which he addresses in Answer to Joe, but I think this is the core idea of all his later works, at least, in regards to Christianity in particular, is that basically God isn't inherently good. God is amoral, and God exists in a state of basically unconsciousness, and thus man has a kind of moral superiority over God. So let's think about what this might mean from our evolutionary framework. So this is the reason why God is considered, this adaptive function is considered the creative universe, is because it's the shaping function of life, that which gives rise to the forms of life, that which produces the mode of being which is appropriate for the environment of life. So it's this process which is just inextricably, we have to assume, is a component of life since its inception. So any pattern of behavior is ultimately, you can trace back to this adaptive function. So this paradisal state is basically the state pre-consciousness, where the man exists in direct communion with God, and the instincts and the adaptive function exist in a symbiotic relationship. There's no conflict between the two. So this is basically the state when the instincts are appropriately adapted to reality. And I guess pleasure would be the normative state. So in this mode of being, the instincts aren't really, patterns of behavior remain consistent throughout the evolutionary development of a species. It's only a dramatic break between the instincts and evolutionary necessity that the inadequacy of the instincts occurs, and a break between the instincts and the adaptive function occurs. So the instincts are basically patterns of behavior generated by the adaptive function, which have become automatized. They've become inaugurated into the a priori or just natural response of the organism to its environment. Whereas the adaptive function is just like some implicit correction mechanism which serves to sublimate these instincts in accordance with evolutionary necessity. And the adaptive function, this is why it's symbolically ascribed omniscience. It can hypothetically modify any. It is the creative function. It gives rise to new patterns of behavior. But there has to be a symbiosis, a relationship between the instincts, between the patterns of behavior which the adaptive function has previously generated. They have to be compatible or commensurate with the mode of being that the adaptive function can generate in accordance with the fluctuations of the environment. So with humanity, however, due to a massive break between the instincts and the external world, the adaptive function and the instincts become separated from each other, meaning the mode of being that is of ideal adapted advantage is not the same, is not commensurate with the patterns of behavior which are already automatized within the organism. So this is when consciousness comes into being. And what the role of consciousness is as the mediator between the instincts and the adaptive function. But in order for the adaptive function to become segregated from the instincts, in other words, in order for the fantasies or new patterns of behavior generated by the imagination, the adaptive function, to occur rather than it producing maladaptive patterns of behavior, is for consciousness to differentiate between the valuable and invaluable modes of being, desires, fantasies, patterns of behavior produced by the adaptive function. It's that differentiation between what is of adaptive advantage and what is unadaptive. That is the role of consciousness. So the process by which this occurs is through an outsourcing, a subjection of one's individual ideal to the ideal of the community. And so any updating of the ideal, which is the result of the subjective experience, has to be commensurate with that social ideal. So the deity is not just or what the deity has been represented as is not just any mode of being, any ideal generated by this adaptive function, but rather the mode of being which is which is of optimal evolutionary optimally evolutionarily advantageous, and that mode of being, by definition, has to be commensurate with the pre-established communal ideal in order for there not to be a conflict to emerge within the community. So before humanity, before the emergence of consciousness, the adaptive function has been able to produce evolutionarily advantageous modes of being throughout the entire history of life. Which is to say, there has never been the necessity for consciousness to participate in its own adaptation to reality. The adaptive function just produces fantasies and patterns of behavior below the conscious level, and consciousness is just purely absorbed in the external world and acting out these instincts without ever coming to realize that it is through doing this working towards the propagation of the species. It's only with the form of consciousness that humanity has to act in accordance, has to modify it. It has to work towards its own. It has to itself participate in the process of its own adaptation. This is what is meant symbolically by the idea that man is made in the image of God. It is through differentiating between. So if you think about like the ego or consciousness is something which gradually develops throughout life. So we generate a whole bunch of patterns of behavior, micro routines, so to speak. These archetypes, these instincts which have been ingrained into us unconsciously become active in particular contexts, around particular people or particular scenarios depending upon what the unconscious senses to be the appropriate behavior response, and we act that out. And then only subsequently do we, later in life, become conscious of that and then generate an ideal in accordance with our experiences and then modify experiences in accordance with that ideal. But it's not like we rationally figure out what the best manner of being would be and then act it out. We act out first and then reflect upon that fact. So this reflection is consciousness itself performing the differentiation between the instincts and the adaptive function, and thus returning God to its true nature, which it means basically, since the adaptive function does not by definition produce an evolutionary advantageous mode of being due to the inadequacy of the instincts, due to its contamination by the instincts, by proximal necessity. Consciousness itself has to differentiate between the valuable modes of being. It has to withdraw itself from possession, purely its absorption within the external world, because then it's just possessed by the instincts, and the instincts are, by definition, patterns of behavior which are suited towards a potentially outdated or redundant evolutionary landscape. So it has to withdraw itself from consciousness, has to withdraw itself from the instincts and have faith in the capacity for a mode of being which corrects for the inadequacies of the patterns of behavior it has already generated, and this allows the adaptive function to generate mode of being or an ideal which more accords with the immediate evolutionary necessity.
From what we've uncovered so far, the problem with consciousness or the individual creating its own values or itself determining what is the most valuable ideal to strive for is that consciousness is possessed by a particular instinctual constitution. As we said, the evolution of consciousness, of the instincts, is always through a reconciliation between the instinct of self-preservation and desire, between egoism and gregarious instincts. So consciousness will always to some extent, identify too far with one of these instinctual, always to some extent identify in an unbalanced way with one of these two instinctual underpinnings. So, however, we have come to the conclusion that the role of consciousness is to improve God, is to so the adaptive function, the process which generates desire and fantasy, must be corrected by consciousness. But this process can only take place. The adaptive function can only decontaminate itself from maladaptive instincts if consciousness detaches itself, dissociates itself from these instincts. And it cannot do this. It cannot recognize the flaw in its own schema of values unless it has faith in something external to the self, which is capable of doing this. This is what was accomplished by the belief in God, the faith in God, that the answers to one's problems will be solved by something external to the self. This humility would prevent consciousness from thinking it has to take up its own role in finding fulfillment and reaching salvation, and then thus facilitate the capacity of the adaptive function to remedy the maladaptive instinctual constitution of consciousness. And then through consciousness, through this process taking place, consciousness evolves and then is then possessed by an evolutionarily beneficial instinctual constitution. So the danger, let's go back to the danger of consciousness trying to create its own values or determine the values upon which the future of mankind is to be predicated. So in the instance of Nietzsche, we can say that he identified too thoroughly with the instincts with desire, with egoism. So this caused like a de-evolution of consciousness. So this, as a result of this, he became unable to relate to humanity, and this gave him his completely opposed schema of value to his age, and inundated him with a sense of superiority, and thus an inability to relate to other people. But as a response to this, he became very lonely, and he wasn't able to actually implement his ideal in actual life, because his ideal was irreconcilable with his age. And thus he was inundated with feelings of inferiority and loneliness. But due to his identification with his ego, his consciousness identifying with a particular instinctual constitution, which prevented... So these feelings of inferiority or loneliness are a means by which the psyche, or the adaptive function, tries to restore balance, tries to get the individual to engage in the particular behaviors by which psychic balance is restored and the ego can evolve towards an evolutionarily beneficial way of being, because he identified with that one instinctual constitution of greatness and self-sufficiency. He rejected these feelings of isolation as just an inundation of a slave morality, as cowardice, but this caused a complete severance between his conscious ideal and the compensatory effect of the unconscious, and this eventually resulted in an undermining of the sanctity of consciousness, and that is what made him insane. If we follow this train of thought, like the idea that he himself said, like, consciousness is predicated upon consciousness came about as like an internalization of a mob or gregarious mode of being, as the
it only came about for communication, and communication is a means of outsourcing adaptation. So humans have to outsource adaptation, they have to live in a dynamic relation with other people by which to evolve the instincts. But he was cut off from that process, and therefore the ego could not sustain itself. Now, the opposite danger of identifying too much with the instinct of self-preservation is we get stuck in the same situation that Christianity put us in, where we end up in nihilism. So Nietzsche found a solution to nihilism through the complete subordination towards an ideal, the ideal of greatness, which is completely incompatible with his age, because his age was not associated, was the emotional intensity which undergirds the desire to dedicate one's life to the achievement of greatness was not shared by the people, so it was unable to implement that. Because a different instinctual constitution underlies modern humanity, which is potentially, not necessarily, but potentially, or it's not the same thing as the ideal of the striving towards greatness, because that's a purely individualistic endeavor, whereas modern humanity, through being undated or identifying with gregarious instincts, is more motivated by things like compassion and the joy which comes from being with other people and being like other people. But the problem with this is that the current behavioral paradigm is insufficient because as we said, God died because its morality was too far on the side of subordinating oneself to one's social role. And so evolution cannot take place. So from this perspective, we can think of scientific materialism as what Nietzsche said in terms of it is the culmination of the will to truth. It's the identification with reality with a purely outsourced conception, a completely shared or good. What is true is that which can be verified by anyone. So Christianity served to make the instinctual constitution, the instinctual underpinnings of consciousness, the instinctual conflicts going on in the unconscious conscious, and the symbols it provided served to facilitate, to guide this process of a conflict of instincts and reconcile it through identifying socially agreeable instincts with good and disagreeable instincts with evil. And by extension, evolutionarily beneficial instincts with good and evolutionarily disadvantageous instincts with evil. However, the death of God, this conceptualization of reality and just and thus the behavioral consequences became insufficient. But so now what we have with scientific materialism, however, is an upholding. So we have gone through the process of consciousness dissociating itself from the instincts. So consciousness has successfully adapted to subordinating itself to a gregarious role. And we have, to some extent, gone through a kind of reintegration of the instincts, which accounts for the kind of hedonism of our age. This is kind of what Nietzsche foresaw as the re-emergence of a tameless form of barbarism as a result of the temporary suppression of the instincts. I don't think this is the way he meant it, though, the way we have ended up. The current hedonism of today is more like a distraction from our underlying nihilism or despair through a constant blocking out of this instinctual conflict through sensory stimulation. But anyway, back to what we were saying before. So with scientific materialism, we've gone through that process, and the will to truth has reached its point of culmination. Reality is purely an outsourced conception because the internal process by which a conception of reality is generated has been stultified through a segregation of consciousness from the instincts. So now, as we said before, consciousness. When consciousness is purely absorbed in the external world, it's purely possessed by the instincts. It's purely possessed by its current behavioral constitution.
Whereas if it's possessed by that which is internally generated, it goes through a process of adaptation of the instincts. The adaptive function is activated, or it becomes absorbed by the active. It becomes one with it, or becomes absorbed by the adaptive function rather than the instincts. In other words, the adaptive function, through its withdrawing from the external world, becomes attached from the instincts, and thus results in their sublimation. But with that adaptation. So from this perspective, we interpret this scientific epistemological framework evolutionarily. Then the fact that the external world is the only reality serves the purpose of maintaining this current state of the current dominant of consciousness, the current instinctual constitution of consciousness, and thus preventing the internal conflict of instincts by which they are sublimated or adapted. This is the exact same thing that Christianity. It's just an extension of the same inundation of a mob mentality and thus subordination of the instincts to gregarious utility that Christianity accomplished. The difference being that we've already gone through the adaptation of our behavior to Christian morality. So the scientific framework just serves to prevent a de-evolution rather than to go through the process of decontamination from the instincts. So this is what underpins the conclusions that scientific materialism reaches, such as consciousness is an epiphenomenon, or there is no such thing as free will. This is a result of an externalization of. This is a result of reality being defined as that which is purely external. So there's division of the subject and object, and then the object is considered the only reality, and the subject is viewed from the perspective of the object, rather than granted its own sphere of, or its own epistemological domain. It's stuffed into this other one, and therefore it is undermined. It's stuffed into its externalized. And the way in which we see the external world is something other than the self, other than the subjective. So if the subjective is viewed as something other than the subjective, then it's obviously just an epiphenomenon. It's not real. It's just driven by automated processes. And so the evolutionary, or the behavioral consequence of this mode of reasoning is that our current instinctual constitution is just maintained, and consciousness does not have to question anything. So this division between subject and object, which self-consciousness is predicated upon, serves the purpose of the differentiation between consciousness and the instincts, or the adaptive function of the instincts, the ending of that symbiotic relationship through consciousness withdrawing itself from the external world. So, as we said earlier, the external world is the domain. When consciousness is purely absorbed in the external world, patterns of behavior manifest in an automated manner. The instincts and external world are co-aligned. So that break between them is a means by which to cause a reconfiguration or sublimation of the instincts. So this extreme division between subject and object that has finally reached modernity, and which gave rise to scientific materialism, is a result of a culmination of Christianity. So Christianity, so the division between subject and object is in order to adapt the self in accordance with evolutionary necessity, because the instincts are not necessarily adapted to evolutionary necessity. So through Christianity placing full responsibility on man, through God being purely good, and therefore the flaws in God's creation are only the completely responsibility of man. The onus is placed purely on the individual as the locus of error, and then as the internal is that which needs to change rather than the external. So this is why for like 1,000 years there was a complete stultification in culture, in
in progress. You could argue in civilization de-evolved to a certain extent after the Roman Empire. But this blockage, this hibernation, eventually became non-sustainable, and thus we reverted to a different, the opposite conception of reality, which is that salvation will be reached through changing the external world. And so this gives rise to the technological revolution. But this process, this reversion could only really take place through after Christianity, because Christianity inoculated us with a group or gregarious conception of reality, and thus served and thus we became adapted to our behavior being prescribed to us from something external, and thus something that is in accordance with evolutionary necessity, with gregarious utility. So the outcome was not necessarily completely social collapse. So we're correlating evolutionary necessity and gregarious utility here, because once civilization reaches such an extent that we don't really have to worry about adapting ourselves in accordance with nature, the primary onus is on us being able to live harmoniously with other people, and so that becomes the ultimate that becomes ultimately that with the external world which we have to adapt in accordance with. So we've concluded that scientific materialism, this culmination of this will for truth, is the ultimate extension of this process of development in which our behavior, our patterns of behavior, are prescribed by society. Our role, our function in life is how we serve our social structures. And thus, our existence is, to a very large extent, predicated on comfort or happiness. Happiness is often used as a disguised word for the uglier term comfort. But life, in essence, is not about achieving greatness anymore. It's about just enjoying yourself. But it's not self-evident that enjoying yourself is sufficient to withhold nihilism. Because that doesn't offhold because the instinct of self-preservation is not able to be overcome by your life being. This is what we meant by hedonism being a way of offholding despair. If the will self-preservation, the will to comfort, has reached the ultimate extension through Christianity in regards to our existence, this hedonism, this distraction and happiness and sensual pleasure, is a means by which to cope with this phenomenon, to apparently reintegrate the instincts. But the reason why this instinct for preservation has become the ultimate instinct of influence, arguably, is because of a relative diminution. It's because of a diminution of the will to power, or the instinct of desire, the instinct which causes us to face the most intolerable burdens of existence, and as a means by which to gain fulfillment. So, anyway, this situation of scientific materialism putting us now in a situation in which the psyche is delegitimized
being that our conception of reality is something purely outsourced. The end ultimate result of that is that we end up with the technological revolution. But also we come to the belief that we start to no longer, since we've to a large extent lost our capacity to ourselves, face the burdens by which we could reach our best level of fulfillment to pursue ultimate greatness, has resulted in a situation through this reversion of our conception of reality, that salvation we reach through the modification of the external world. We become reliant upon external change in order to overcome despair, and thus we're prevented from the means by which we could ourselves accomplish this, which is the only means by which we can accomplish this, because the ulterior situation is to not overcome being possessed by the self-preservation instinct, the instinct which produces nihilism. So what happens here is that these archetypal ideas, these archetypal beliefs become projected. So these ideas like God has become society, because the internal mechanism by which reality can be altered or in accordance with the means by which to reach salvation that our access to that experience has been cut off. So it's become projected, and since it's become projected, and thus the state is God, and the kingdom of God, that which gives meaning to our lives, that which the belief which is necessary to enable us to live in accordance with a strict constriction of the instincts, in accordance with gregarious utility. That's become projected as some kind of utopian vision. And this evil. And so good is your particular idea of what this utopian society would be. Whether it's found in some kind of national identity or some kind of socialistic kind of utopian vision of complete happiness and prosperity for everyone. So that people with your particular moral ethos is good. People with an opposed moral ethos, I think I just articulated. I think those two are the two primary different kind of utopian visions. But the ulterior to that is demonized as evil. And thus, the means by which salvation is reached, that fulfillment is gained, the particular restrictions against that are projected onto other people, and thus we end up in like a warlike situation. That is a warlike mentality. So what Christianity did is it withdrew these conceptions of a reality which are grounded within an instinctual basis. These are means by which, ways in which to conceive of reality as a means by which to cause a particular instinctual behavioral response. It's not rationality top down; it's instincts up to rationality. It's a means of withdrawing them and thus preventing the anti-evolutionary patterns of behavior which result from these instincts possessing our consciousness of reality. So that mechanism has been undermined through scientific materialism. Nietzsche himself predicted that the 20th century would be a era of warfare as a result of the death of God. And the 20th century was the era of the greatest bloodbaths in human history. So
you can't just dismiss that point from kind of some materialistic skepticism. That's a genuine prediction that actually came to me. So it's the ultimate result of just being possessed by this instinct for self-preservation and not going through the process by which the instincts are adapted. Through not reintegrating this will to power, this will to self-determination, this will to take full responsibility for your reaching your own fulfillment, your own salvation. The ultimate consequence of that is through the suppression of this will to power, it has a compensatory influence and causes de-evolution of consciousness to an older, more archaic, arguably pagan, dominant of consciousness, means by which to conceive a reality or instinctual constitution. So the remedy to this situation is we have to analyze the manner in which the instincts are orienting our conception of reality, and thus are as a means by which to withdraw these projections. Projections meaning beliefs which serve a particular instinctual function on both an individual and collective level. So we've tried to analyze scientific materialism to a certain extent. I think the fundamental error here with scientific materialism is it is a outsourced conception of reality fundamentally. Through our adaptation to an outsourced or gregarious conception of reality, the reality of the psyche in a subjective experience of the instincts, of the means, the experience of the internal conflicts which undergirds consciousness as a means by which the adaptive function can revive instincts which can serve to overcome this instinctual conflict and thus adapt the instincts in accordance with the means by which to find fulfillment, and as an extension of that, the means by which to ensure the evolution of the species. Through our adaptation to an outsourced gregarious conception of reality, we've been cut off from that process, and thus we have scientific materialism, which is just the reality of the external world. So this scientific materialism cuts you off from any kind of internally generated meaning as an illusion. So anything of a subjective origin. And thus we end up with the idea that, existence is meaningless, or, or random mutation. There's no order, there's no participate, you do not play a role in defining or you do not play a role in determining the future of the species, in determining whether the species will survive into the future or not. Scientific materialism it's automated processes driven by random mutation, which completely, and consciousness does not participate in this process. Consciousness is just, it's just an epiphenomenon, right? This is a defense mechanism against the burdening responsibility which comes from the realization that you are an incarnation of the evolutionary process. The evolution, God himself, the existence of evolution does not exist outside the individual. So this is what these religious systems are trying to understand. They're trying to deal with this problem of the individual being both something which is temporary and flawed and mortal, but also an incarnation of something that is immortal and something which we do not, of something the significance of which completely transcends our capacity to comprehend. So the means by which to rectify the situation appears to be to assume that the entire reason why you are not the best version of yourself is your own fault. This is the idea of Christ taking on the sins of mankind. This because what this process accomplishes psychologically is it causes a withdrawing of projections. It stops us from thinking, okay, this is just the reason why I'm not living the most ideal life I could is because that's just the way the world is, because the external world is just situated, it's just positioned in this manner, and oh well, I'll just have to adapt to the external world. That's the reason why you could ever reach such a conception of reality, is because you're being driven by the instinct of self-preservation, because of its purely weakness and cowardice. In order to overcome nihilism, and this is the greatest part of Nietzsche, is to resurrect this master morality. Because once you do that, once you take full responsibility for everything, then this will initially cause a great deal of suffering. Your ego will be undermined. Which basically means the patterns of behavior, the manner in which you adapted to reality will lose its self-evident sanctity, and thus cause a kind of a despair. But this is the same thing as consciousness withdrawing itself from the external world. You recognize that the external world is made up of a projection of instincts which unconsciously undergird consciousness and potentially do not serve your best interests. Once you go through that process, you cause a reconfiguration of the instincts, and then part of you which has not been activated will become activated. So this is kind of a reintegration of this will to power. And this will hypothetically give you sufficient self-sufficiency and a sufficiently correct conception of reality by which to reach your most ideal mode of being. So this is this idea of a resurrection of latent instinctual tendencies which are not presently activated, is the constant idea in mythology of the resurrection of the dead king or the dying king, the old king. That's a universal motif. I haven't heard of it. I don't know of any mythology really that does not contain some version of that archetypal idea. And so that's the idea of correcting God. So this adaptive function is, as we said earlier, is consciousness in itself. It's not consciousness as such. It's not because you don't you are phenomenologically consciousness phenomenologically, which is not the same thing as consciousness in itself, is consciousness reflecting itself to itself. It's an image. It's an image which serves a particular instinctual response. So what you're doing through correcting the maladaptive nature of the adaptive function of the function which gives rise to conceptions of reality, and as an extension, instinctual or patterns of behavior, instinctual interactions with a reality. What you're doing it through taking full responsibility for everything is you're withdrawing these projections, and thus you're eventually correcting the faculty by which desire and fantasy is generated. So I think the ultimate philosophical idea which epitomizes the necessary correction in terms of a worldview to the nihilism which ensues from the death of God is Nietzsche's idea of the eternal reoccurrence. So this idea of eternal reoccurrence is that if you were presented with the prospect that you had to, your life, every instant of your life would have to be repeated for an eternity, the affirmative attitude you would have to that is to embrace it as completely like the most divine thing that you had ever heard. Which means that's not just a formula for how to live your life. That's not just like you should live your life as though you had to live it over and over again. Also, although you could also interpret it as that. What it means is you to interpret every moment of your life as of providing sufficient worth to your existence that it would be worth it being repeated. Which means, as an extension, that means accepting the worst suffering in the world as justified, as worthwhile. Because suffering is not fulfillment or satisfaction with existence comes from the overcoming of suffering. The suffering and pleasure or fulfillment are inextricably intertwined. You don't get the one without the other. This is why Nietzsche says at some point, Beyond Good and Evil or something, I think, that he would wish for a world in which there was more suffering rather than less. Because the degree of suffering you have, by definition, implies that by definition gives rise to the opportunity to reach a proportionate level of fulfillment through its overcoming. Well, anyway, I don't know how to conclude this thing properly. I've been working on it for way too long, so I think this is just where we're gonna have to end this. Sorry if it was kind of incoherent, but I was trying to work through these ideas as I was filming it, so anyway, thanks for watching.